All right, welcome back to Double Fries, No Slaw. Obviously, you have seen now a settlement is pending, or at least in the works, between Florida State and the ACC, Clemson and the ACC, to drop lawsuits and then amend and adjust some things to keep Florida State and Clemson in this league for at least the next several years. This has been reported everywhere, whether you're looking at Dellinger or the folks over at ESPN, Thamel and those. But it seems like tomorrow, Florida State, Clemson, the ACC will all drop their lawsuits in exchange for a few things. I think that ultimately we'll talk about this being a win for Florida State and Clemson. I don't think it's the win that fans or you or I wanted, but it is an ultimate win in getting the ACC to compromise. It proves a couple of things. Now, did we all want to be out of this conference tomorrow and be somewhere else? Absolutely. Was that ever realistic? And anything we talked about with Doug from a legal perspective, it was pretty unlikely. Doug continued to tell us from the very first time we did a video with him, which we do have a video with him dropping tomorrow once some of this agreement is made public and we kind of have more details around it. Tune in tomorrow and make sure you don't miss that. But is it what we have basically theorized would happen since December of 2023 when the lawsuits were filed? Yes, we thought both sides would eventually settle. Some questions to be answered, though. How much of a win is it for Florida State? Why did other teams in the conference, why are they agreeing to this? What does it mean for Florida State's financial perspective? We'll try and give you our best thoughts on all of that. The first thing to note here is that we think, and it's been rumored, that we are going to see increased revenue for programs that bring in the most eyeballs. Florida State had a disastrous 2024 season and still was one of the top teams in this conference when it came to the number of people that watched their program. In fact, it wasn't even close when you consider the teams at the bottom of the list, the Wakes and the BCs and the Syracuses. Not even close with what Florida State still brought in from a revenue perspective, a TV eyeball perspective. Pete Thamel of ESPN reporting that 40% of TV money is going to be distributed evenly through legacy ACC schools, so not your Cals or Stanfords or SMUs, but the teams that have been in this conference for a while. And then 60% would be based on a ratings formula over the last 5 years. Well, Florida State did very well in 2024, even despite only winning one ACC game, and then obviously did very well in 23, 22, and then going backwards. Top ACC earners could earn more than $15 million, while some schools will see a net deduction in annual payout of about $7 million. So a big deal for Florida State to, when Doug was on the last time, we talked about what he would ultimately want is, could we get up to that $15 to $20 million more per year to close the gap with the big boys? The second part of this is that the grant of rights and the penalties to leave the ACC could be reduced to under $100 million by that 2030-2031 calendar academic year. Right now, the penalty, the exit fee to leave the conference is over $120 million. And so to get that penalty to leave the conference to under 100 by 2030 is a huge win. There's also the question of how much are the grant of rights, your media rights, worth? Well, right now in the agreement, there is no penalty for that. The conference just owns the rights to them, right? Like you leave the conference, there's no money you owe. They just keep your rights. You essentially have to buy them back, which is not detailed out super well in the agreement that they've got right now. Obviously, nobody thought that somebody would be leaving a conference like this. And so that wasn't put into the agreement. And so at this point, you would owe hundreds of millions of dollars. We've speculated of $570 million around the year 2030. You're going to owe less than 100. That's a huge win for Florida State, right? You want to be out tomorrow. I get that. We all want to be in the Big Ten or the SEC, anything independent, anything but the ACC. But to get that chopped down pretty significantly, get half the years cut off, and instead of it being $280 million or $265 million, like half of it, you're talking about less than $100 million. That will not be a problem for Florida State to come up with once that time comes. I want to talk about some concerns I have with this. I want to talk about maybe some still problems we have with this, some problems with this whole thing taking place. But first, I do want to give some love to our friend over at Russo and Company. That's Chris Russo. He's been a CPA since 2000. He's had his MBA since 2004. He's also got a law degree, 25 years plus of experience in fields such as tax preparation, tax help, working with sole proprietors, working with folks who have businesses, LLCs. It is tax season. And if you need any assistance with accounting and bookkeeping, maybe cash reconciliations, payroll processing, 1099 or W-2 preparation, anything with your income taxes or income tax planning and preparation, he will absolutely get you taken care of. He can help you with business startups, financial planning, retirement services, whatever you're in need of from a tax perspective, a financial perspective, he will get you settled and taken care of correctly. Treats all of his clients like their money is his own. He doesn't like the IRS, just like you probably don't either, and he will fight for every cent of your money. Russo and Co. Make sure that you contact them. The info is down there below me on the screen, as well as in the description. Let him know that Double Fries No Slaw sent you. He'll do a free consultation to see if his services would be a fit for your needs. A big problem with all of this is that we just wasted the last year and a half, because this is what FSU asked for in 2023, early in that year, right? This is what Michael Alford came out and said, we need unequal revenue sharing. And the ACC looked him in the face. The other presidents in the conference looked him in the face and said, nope, we're not doing that. No chance, no way we're doing that. And so what did Florida State do? Later that year, they filed a lawsuit. We've been in this legal battle for a year and a half now, almost a year and a half. Clemson has joined in. Carolina has at least done their due diligence on needing to maybe join in. And ultimately, this has cost everyone in the conference money, Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina the most, but this has cost everyone in the conference money because who's paying for the ACC's legal fees? Well, all 18 members of the conference are paying for those legal fees. And so this has been a complete waste of time because the ACC just wouldn't give Florida State what they asked for back in 2023 early. In fact, not only is Florida State getting what they asked for with unequal revenue sharing, they are also getting a reduction in the amount of time that they have to be in this conference. Think about that, right? You may be frustrated with the result. You may be frustrated with the fact that we're not out of the conference tomorrow. But if they would have just given what Florida State asked for back in 2023, Florida State would still be locked in until 2036. But instead, it very much seems that Florida State's going to have an escape path, an escape hatch to pull when the year 2030 rolls around. And is it what we wanted? Do we want to be out of this conference even faster? Absolutely. Do we still hope that there's some silver bullet that can get us there? ESPN moving chess pieces or whatever that might be. Sure. But if the ACC had just done what Florida State asked back in 2023, they wouldn't be in even a worse spot right now, with 2030 being the year that the conference will lose its biggest members. Now, it's not a complete win or loss for either side, but if I've got to say who won this, it is 100% Florida State and Clemson. If the gap is going to be closed by $15 to $20 million with the big boys, with the SEC and the Big Ten, that's a huge, huge win for the Seminoles and for the Tigers and for other programs within this conference who bring in the most eyeballs. For a long time, you've heard Michael Alford and the folks at Florida State talk about how Florida State brings in 15% of the eyeballs to this conference and takes home about 7% of the revenue from that. It is completely unequal, and now that is going to be slated more toward Florida State's way. Now, I know we'll get comments. Well, you went 2-10 last year, and if you continue to go 2-10, yeah, are you going to pull in the same number of eyeballs? Florida State still had a top 5 viewership within this conference, even with going 2-10. Even with their season being a complete abject disaster and failure. Florida State's out-of-conference matchups are still going to bring in eyeballs unlike any other teams in this country. You think about when they play Notre Dame, or they play Alabama this year, or they play Florida every year at the end of the year. They will still bring in a huge amount of that pie because of the way they schedule. And if they go 2-10 again this year, they're going to fire their coach, and there will be the excitement around a new coach in 2026. So I'm not so worried about that. But yes, if they continue to go 2-10, I would expect that their ratings drop. I still think they beat out the teams like Wake and Cal and Stanford and BC and Syracuse and Duke and others. Would just be my guess. The other side of this that's a huge win is that maybe that grant of rights wasn't as solid as some Twitter attorneys might have had you think it was. That's not at Rohan. Rohan was telling you that from day one. But if that grant of rights was so solid as people would have led you to believe, who had very vested interests in wanting to see the ACC stick around, why would the ACC give in? Why would the ACC even budge here? And so again, Florida State getting what they originally asked for, which is unequal revenue sharing, but also getting a reduction in the time that they will spend in this conference. Is it as big of a reduction as fans wanted? Absolutely not. The ACC knew that their grant of rights wasn't as solid as people told you it was, and that's why they're budging to around that 2030 year timeline. I still have some concerns here. Let's be very frank. Let's be very honest. The money worry is still there. Now, Florida State can make between $15 and $20 million more per year by being at the top of the revenue generated because of TV numbers, because of Nielsen ratings, because of eyeballs. That is good. It is going to significantly close the gap the next couple of years. That gap gets wider and wider and wider the closer we get to 2030, and you may see a $35 to $40 million gap between the Big Ten and the SEC. But I do think that you can kind of withstand that 2-year gap, right? If you get to 2028 and you've got a $40 million gap and you're making $20 million a year more, that is still a $20 million gap in between, but you can withstand that for a year or two, right? 2028, 29, 30. That's not going to kill you the same way that a $30, $40 million gap would kill you over the span of 5 or 6 years. However, when you consider the college football playoff money that's going to be coming in, the difference there, how the SEC is certainly going to have more teams in and get a bigger piece of the pie for each one of their teams that does get in, it is somewhat concerning the closer and closer we get toward that 2030 year. Does Florida State maybe pony up that money to get out a year or two earlier? It's probably unlikely, just thinking about how TV contracts will probably all kind of align with that 2030 number. What can Florida State do to be creative? Clemson do to be creative in the meantime? But I will say that this solves a small problem. It's small. It solves a major problem. It just doesn't completely eliminate that problem. A 20-year boost or a $20 million boost, a $15 million boost, you certainly would prefer that over zero, but it doesn't completely eliminate the problem. There's still a pretty good gap that will need to be made up. However, again, if it's 2 or 3 years that you're having to make up that gap and then you're out, it's certainly better than 10 plus, right? Why would other teams agree to this? Why did BC and Wake and Syracuse, why would they say yes to this? Well, the ESPN agreement is the answer. The ESPN extension from 2027 to 2036 had contingencies in it that required the lawsuits to get settled. Florida State, Clemson, and a majority of the ACC had already agreed upon a good deal of this in principle going back to July of 24, but there were certainly teams holding out. And to force the teams like Wake Forest and Boston College to actually make a move, ESPN basically said that we are going to extend the contract, but it's going to be contingent on a settlement, which falls within these bounds that they were already agreed upon. So when they vote on this tomorrow, the teams aren't only voting to give FSU and Clemson more and defining the cost to leave, they're also voting for the ACC to continue to exist beyond 2027. Because if they voted against it, I think the extension ceases to exist. I think ESPN only ended up extending this conference deal with the ACC because they were assured that this would go through, that settlements would happen, that they would have stability up through at least 2030 and then 2030 and beyond, even if it was without Florida State and Clemson. So other programs, the Wakes and the Boston Colleges and the Cals, the voting members that aren't necessarily going to benefit from this, they had no option. It was either vote for this or the conference ceases to exist because ESPN doesn't renew the agreement. So, again, all of this could have been avoided had Florida State been given what they asked for in early 2023. But they weren't. A bunch of attorneys made a crap load of money. It cost every team in the conference something, cost Florida State and Clemson the most. But in just year one of this new agreement, Florida State will make back all of their legal fees and then more. They will make back 500% of their legal fees. And so was it worth it? Yes, it absolutely was. Is it the massive Grand Slam walk-off win that everybody wanted to be out of the conference tomorrow and playing in another conference for the 2025 season? No, it's not that. But it is a win regardless. Love to hear your thoughts. Love to get your take down below in the comments. Again, we'll have Doug Rohan on, Rohan Law, tomorrow afternoon. I think he and I are chatting around 3:30, so that video should be out before 5 p.m. Eastern. Make sure that you're subscribed and you don't miss that. Again, it is tax season. If you need anything for tax services for your business, personal, whatever you need, hit up Chris Russo. He's a Nole just like you and I are. Details for him are in the description. We appreciate you guys for tuning in to Double Fries No Slaw.